It was in late 2014 that Najari Torres first began noticing men traipsing through her building on a heavily Orthodox Jewish block in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. They wielded large tools and even drove an excavator into the backyard. The building manager reassured her, they were merely making repairs. But when the workers began bricking up Ms. Torres's kitchen windows, choking off the apartment's light and blocking her views of the yard where her young daughters often played, she grew distraught. Ms. Torres dialed 311, and several months later, in July, a city building inspector arrived at her home at 94 Franklin Avenue. The first thing he did was look in the backyard and told me the construction had blocked our emergency exit, said Ms. Torres, a 40-year-old Mexico City native, who has been in New York for 15 years. She works as a housekeeper, and she spoke through an interpreter as she sat recently at a conference table in her lawyer's office. Her 6-year-old daughter, Gethsemane, out of school with a fever, quietly dozed next to her. He asked me, if there was an emergency, how would you leave with your kids? Ms. Torres continued. He said the building wasn't safe. That afternoon the inspector ordered Ms. Torres and her neighbors to vacate their apartments. By midnight, she said, she found herself at a seedy hotel in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, shushing her girls to sleep, surrounded by the few belongings she managed to collect in garbage bags. 3 years later, the family is still not home. They have been living in a temporary shelter in Brownsville, an hour's commute from the children's schools and her job. The building on Franklin Avenue is still vacant and increasingly derelict. Belongings that the tenants hadn't managed to remove have been ruined by water damage and vermin. The illegal structure that the landlord was erecting a synagogue, it turns out also remains. Ms. Torres's case is a pronounced example of what rent-stabilized tenants are facing across Brooklyn, housing advocates said. Monthly median rent has surged over the past decade, increasing 79.5% to $2,334 in Bedford-Stuyvesant in January, according to data from the appraisal firm Miller Samuel. In response to the rising rents, housing advocates say, landlords have taken to making their rent-stabilized buildings uninhabitable, often under the guise of performing repairs, so they can renovate and remove them from the rent stabilization program. The practice has come to be known as construction as harassment. As gentrification has spread across North Brooklyn, landlords are taking advantage of the laxity in enforcement by city agencies to force out tenants, said Shikhar Krishnan, a director at Brooklyn Legal Services Corporation, a tenant advocacy group. A series of bills passed the New York City Council last year to curb this landlord behavior, but Mr. Krishnan is wary that they will be followed. There's already a lot of laws on the books for tenants, he said, and it doesn't mean anything if the city agencies don't enforce them. Landlords say the effort is overkill. We are the only city in the world where offering someone money to move out is considered harassment, said Frank Ricci, the Director of Government Affairs at the Rent Stabilization Association, a landlord advocacy group. A lot of times, what tenants claim is harassment is bogus. Nonetheless, several city officials agreed that Ms. Torres's 3-year odyssey was a particularly galling situation. The family has spent 3 Christmases in a shelter, and that is 100% unacceptable for anyone, including us in government, to countenance, said Stephen T. Levin, the councilman who represents the area. Mr. Levin said that he was trying to hammer out a compromise with the landlord, so far with no success. What has been done to these tenants is unconscionable, said Joseph Soldevera, a spokesman for the city's Department of Buildings. Unfortunately, what this case represents above all, said Mr. Soldevera, is that owners, particularly using the legal process, can draw things out even when the city brings out all the guns we have. After the inspector first came to 94 Franklin Avenue, the landlord, the Tiferes Yehuda Family Trust, filed plans to make improvements to the tenant's building. The proposal lacked several key changes, and the city rejected it. The landlord returned with new plans in 2016, but they too were incomplete, failing to account for emergency exits and missing floor plans. The city also rejected this proposal. At that point, the buildings department issued a criminal court summons against the landlord. The case dragged on for a year, with both sides having to make more than half a dozen court appearances. Finally, last September, the trustees of the Tiferes Yehuda Family Trust, Esther and Joseph Schneebalg, pleaded guilty to failing to maintain a safe building for the tenants and to working without a permit. The Schneebalgs were each fined $15,000, and the trust was fined an additional $20,000. This was on top of $14,000 in fines levied against the building over the previous months. The trust now has a new trustee, Meir Schwartz. As of late January, none of the $64,000 in fines had been paid, according to the buildings department. Last August, the city had finally approved a plan submitted by the landlord to repair and bring the entire site up to code. This would also make the synagogue legal. The squat, yellow structure, which takes up the space where the backyard had been, is accessible only by entering the front door of 94 Franklin Avenue. The synagogue is being built for some 100 congregants from the neighborhood, who had been searching for several years for a new home, said Meryl L. Wenig, the lawyer representing Mr. Schwartz, of the Tiferes Yehuda Trust. Yet at the moment, the building, like Ms. Torres's apartment building, is not being used. A visit to the site on a recent Friday night, when observant Jews attend Sabbath services, found it padlocked. Last month, an inspector from the buildings department visited 94 Franklin to check on the renovations. He discovered that the contractor hired by the landlord was busy making improvements to the synagogue but had not completed any work on the apartments. The landlord was ordered to stop all work on the synagogue and was given until mid-March to fix the apartments. If the repairs are not done, said Alexandra Fisher, the department's Deputy Commissioner of Legal and Regulatory Affairs, her agency will work with the city's law department to seek more penalties and even jail time. My client would love to finish the construction and put the tenants back, said Ms. Wenig, the lawyer representing Mr. Schwartz, adding that the demolition work on the apartment building had begun but soon had to stop when unforeseen structural issues were discovered. Even after we finish construction, we have to get a new certificate of occupancy, and that is never fast, she said. I'll call it the maze of bureaucracy. The buildings department said it was possible that once the tenants' apartments were deemed habitable, the agency would issue a temporary certificate of occupancy, enabling the tenants to return while the landlord completed the remaining work. In the meantime, Ms. Torres and her family are struggling. One never expects to be taken out of their home like that, she said through an interpreter. My middle daughter has been the most affected. She listens to everything and will say things like, Don't forget, Mommy, tomorrow you have a court date. That girl, Tamara, 10, has asthma that worsened as a result of the construction at 94 Franklin, and she has met with a psychologist while living at the shelter to deal with depression resulting from the ordeal. New York City Housing Preservation and Development, the agency responsible for finding housing for the residents of 94 Franklin Avenue, said it had done its best. H.P.D. offered all of the tenants at this building alternative permanent housing, an agency spokeswoman, Juliette Pierre-Antoine, said in a statement. All but one of the tenants are now housed. Angel Moreno, for instance, found a new home, but at a much higher rent. He had lived at 94 Franklin Avenue for 15 years, paying $975 a month. He now lives in Crown Heights and pays $1,400 a month. H.P.D. also offered Ms. Torres and her family 2 apartments through the New York City Housing Authority. But they were both in Harlem, which meant an even longer commute to her children's schools and her work than she was already making from the shelter. She rejected the apartments, and the housing authority closed her case. Recently, Mr. Schwartz, the trustee, also offered to pay for housing for Ms. Torres and her family during the construction at 94 Franklin Avenue. He even provided listings of possible apartments, said his lawyer, Ms. Wenig. The offer, however, was too little too late, said Mr. Krishnan, the housing advocate. It failed to take in the years of struggle that the family had faced and was also contingent on Ms. Torres's agreeing to settle a lawsuit she had filed. Ms. Torres and her neighbor Mr. Moreno filed suit against the landlord in 2016. It was based on an emergency statute that requires the court to begin adjudicating the case within 5 days. The case, however, dragged on for a year before it was dismissed. Rather than appeal, Ms. Torres refiled the case and it is continuing. One reason for the delay was that Housing Court has just one room set aside for the entire borough of Brooklyn to hear repair-related proceedings brought by tenants. By contrast, there are 14 courtrooms reserved for landlord-tenant disputes, most of which are initiated by landlords pursuing evictions. Ms. Torres hopes her story may spur change. It isn't fair that we are displaced from a community where my kids were born, she said. It's been more than 2.5 years in a shelter, and no one has done anything. I hope that after all this, something positive will happen.